Welcome, sleepy soul. You found your way back to the Sleepy Historian, your soft-spoken sanctuary for calming bedtime storytelling, slow narration, and gentle journeys into forgotten folds of the past. This is a home of boring history, and we say that with pride. Here, we don't rush. We don't dramatize. We simply wander, with hushed curiosity and slow exhalations, into dusty kitchens, quiet corners of castles, and into the rhythm of lives long faded. If you've been searching for boring history for sleep, for soft-spoken history documentaries, or for relaxing history to fall asleep to, then you're in just the right place. Let the world fade. Let your muscles unwind. Let your thoughts drift like steam from a copper pot. Tonight, we step into the stone-walled kitchens of medieval castles, smoky, echoing spaces where firelight flickers and hands never stop working. But this isn't a cooking show. It's a lullaby made of breadcrumbs, broth, and burnt corners of history. Because the life of a castle cook was not glamorous. They didn't twirl about in embroidered aprons or present dishes with sprigs of rosemary. They sweated. They shouted. They stirred cauldrons taller than their shoulders and butchered beasts before sunrise. They baked for hours, chopped for hours, ladled and lifted and lugged sacks of grain, all while trying not to be scolded by nobles who never touched a spoon. And the recipes? They range from magnificent to mildly horrifying. Sweetmeats wrapped in dough, boiled eels, roasted peacock, onion porridge, almond milk stew. Enough food to feed 100 guests or to offend a modern appetite. Tonight, we'll explore the strange truth of what castle cooks really did. The meals they made, the tools they used, the stories simmering beneath each bubbling pot. So, if you're a fan of history sleep stories, storytelling with ambient sounds, or simply want to fall asleep to boring history, prepare to be lulled by the soft sizzle of meat on an open flame and the quiet hum of the past. Let's begin, shall we? Just imagine it's dawn. The castle is still dark, and somewhere in the lower kitchens, a wooden ladle is already stirring. Imagine yourself not as a lord or lady, not even as a knight or page, but as a cook, a castle cook. Your name doesn't matter. No one will remember it. History usually didn't. But you are essential, even if no one ever thanks you. It's still dark, very dark. The stones underfoot are cold and a little damp, and the only light comes from the dying embers of last night's hearth. It's your job to wake the fire, not metaphorically. Literally, you shuffle toward the great hearth that dominates the lower kitchen, kneel down, and begin to coax it back to life. A few sparks, then a flicker. You feed it carefully with kindling, stacked high in a basket. There's a particular rhythm to this. You've done it 1,000 times. You'll do it 1,000 more. As the flames rise, so does the scent. Not sweet, not savory, but a smoky mixture of yesterday's roast and today's damp logs. The warmth creeps outward, but not fast enough for your fingers, already stiff from the morning chill. There are no clocks. Time here is measured by tasks. And your first task, always, is to heat water. Always water. Buckets are hauled in from the well, cold, heavy, and sloshing. The pot is enormous, iron-bellied and soot-streaked. You hoist it with practiced muscle memory, your arms stronger than many soldiers. You don't think of that, of course. You're just getting through the day. Today's menu? That depends on who's staying in the castle. Is it just the lord and his family? You might get away with a simpler morning. Warm ale and oat cakes. Maybe spice porridge thick with cream if you're lucky. But if there are guests, or, heaven forbid, a hunting party returning, then prepare yourself. Venison, boar, fowl, all roasted, stewed, or baked in pies. Pastries with sweet fillings. Breads, always breads, and more ale than water. Because, well, the water wasn't always trustworthy. But before you can even think of seasoning a stew or plucking a pheasant, there are fires attending all the hearths, ovens to check, bread dough to monitor, and a swarm of kitchen boys to yell at. Yes, you yell. A lot. They're late again. One's missing entirely. Another's asleep behind a flour sack. You'd think they were the ones up before dawn. You bark orders. Fetch eggs. Stir that pot. Watch the ash doesn't clog the chimney again. There's no malice in your voice, just fatigue wrapped in urgency. If you fall behind now, the entire day collapses. You've learned shortcuts. Of course. The meat is half prepped from yesterday. The barley's already soaked. The eels, well, they're still squirming the pail, but that's a problem for later. Above you, the castle begins to stir. Chambermaids sweep the floors. The steward checks the larders. The Lord's hound howls once, long and low. Breakfast must be ready within the hour. And so you move, like you always do. Efficient, unhurried but never idle. The large wooden spoon in your hand might as well be a sword. You wield it with the precision of a knight and the command of a captain. Soon, the smell begins to spread. Bacon fat crackling, bread baking, honey melting over dried plums, a hint of sage in the air. A moment of calm passes. You pause, hand on hip, breath fogging gently in the kitchen's warmth. Then someone bursts in, a young page with frantic eyes. The master wants broth. Now. And just like that, the rhythm resumes. As the castle fully wakes, the kitchen transforms from a sleepy cavern into a buzzing hive. There's no moment of silence now. The wooden tables groan under the weight of ingredients. Sacks of flour, fresh onions, basket of herbs, live chickens that need plucking, and salted fish stacked like scrolls. The air is thick, with smoke, steam, and the scent of roasted bones. The fire roars now, not just in the main hearth, but in ovens and secondary cooking pits. Iron grates hiss, cauldrons bubble, and knives, so many knives, glint in the morning light leaking into a small, soot-smudged window. You, the cook, oversee all. You don't measure ingredients. Recipes, if they exist, live in your head. A pinch of this, a dash of that. Your fingers know how much. Your nose tells you when something is close to burning. Your ears catch the wrong sort of bubbling. A pot about to boil over, or a stew sticking to the bottom. There's no time to taste, no room for artistry. This isn't a chef's kitchen. This is survival, service, duty. You're preparing for dozens, sometimes over 100, depending on feasts, travelers, clergy, or soldiers returning from patrol. One of the kitchen boys rushes in, out of breath, holding a torn scrap of parchment, a message from the steward. The Lord has changed his mind. He desires freshwater fish for the midday meal, with green sauce. You don't roll your eyes. You've learned not to. Instead, you adjust. Green sauce, parsley, sage, vinegar, garlic, breadcrumbs, maybe a touch of wine. You send a runner to the fish ponds. The sauce can begin now. At your elbow, a young scullery maid is weeping quietly. She sliced her finger while gutting turnips. You wrap it quickly in a rag, pat her on the shoulder, and send her to the corner to sit. That's all the comfort you can spare. One of the kitchen fires goes out. Smoke backs up into the room. You cough, wave it away, and grab more kindling. The oven's too cold now. The bread may not rise. Still, you push forward. The rhythm resumes. You call out, check the pies. Is that beef seasoned yet? More salt. Not that much. Never mind, I'll do it. The noise is constant. The hiss of boiling. The clang of pots. The chopping, mincing, grinding. The creak of the spit as it turns a haunch of meat over hot coals. And voices raised, rushed, rumbling. The castle above you may be made of stone and silence, but down here below the Great Hall, you create something louder than music. Organized chaos. You know what's coming. Once the hourglass is turned, the servers will descend in a parade of wooden trays and cloth-wrapped jugs. They'll load up with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, filled with stew, slices of roast, cooked roots, and sauce. The guests above will barely think about where their food came from. But you'll know. Your back aches. Your brow is damp. And there's flour in places where flour shouldn't be. Still, there's something comforting in the noise, the heat, the pressure. You've been here before. You'll be here tomorrow. It's the same, and that's the point. The bell rings. Not the chapel bell, but the smaller, sharper one, hung just outside the kitchen. It means only one thing. The Lord and his household are seated. The first dishes must be ready. Not 5 minutes from now. Now. It's a moment that always arrives too soon, and yet it's the moment everything builds toward. You take a deep breath. Then, with practiced grace, you begin the procession of platters. You don't serve the Lord directly. No. That is the job of the steward and the hall's servants, in their fine doublets and clean hands. But you orchestrate the meal as surely as a conductor leads a choir. Roasted capon with honey glaze. Pottages thick with beans and leeks. Fish laid out in intricate patterns, garnished with herbs and edible flowers. Trenchers with meat, savory pies, turnips, parsnips, cheese rounds, and baskets of coarse, crusty bread. And sauces, so many sauces. Vinegar and wine. Almond milk thickened with bread. Green sauces, yellow sauces, sharp and sweet, herbed and spiced. It's not fine dining in the modern sense, but it is elaborate and timed. Dishes must come in order. No repeats. No confusion. The servants line up. Platters are handed off. You watch them vanish through the heavy door into the hall above. Then silence. You wait. And finally, the sound returns, not clanging this time, but muted thumps and soft calls from above. The feast has begun. You take a moment to sip from a warm mug of watered ale, not to celebrate, simply to hydrate, because soon the empty trenchers will return, bones gnawed, crumbs scattered, and the next course must go up. There's always another course. For special feasts, you might send up jellied eels shaped like swans. For holidays, a boar's head with an apple in its mouth. For weddings, custards carved into towers. For ordinary days, it's simply hot food. On time. Again and again. Eventually, the final dishes go out. Tarts filled with dried fruit and spice wine. Honey cakes. Maybe candied nuts or stewed pears. If there's enough sugar, always precious, you might try to impress with molded jelly or sweet paste. By the time the last course is cleared, your lower kitchen looks like the aftermath of a storm. Trays, bowls, pots, knives, ladles, all stacked sticky and hot. The fire is still burning. The air is heavy. The bread crusts under your boots have hardened. But your job is not finished. Now begins the cleanup. The water's heated again. The boys scrub the pots. The maids gather cloths and toss scraps to the dogs outside. You make mental notes of what ingredients are low, what tools are broken, what servants you'll scold tomorrow. Upstairs, the lords recline with wine, wiping their fingers on embroidered cloth, talking of hunts and taxes. The music begins. Down here, you wipe your hands on your apron and check the larders one last time. The kitchen quiets. Only the fire crackles now. You sit, just for a moment, on the same stool you've always used, near the warmest corner. You stare into the hearth and think of nothing, not because you're simple, but because your thoughts are spent. The rhythm of your life is not defined by glory or fame or poetry. It's measured in spoons stirred, oven stoked, bread loaves counted. And in the calm after the feast, You find something close to peace. Imagine yourself not in the smoky kitchen now, but in a grand Tudor castle in the mid-1500s. The air is perfumed with rose water and crushed herbs. Tapestries rustle softly as people move, and above it all sits one of the most powerful women in the world, Queen Elizabeth I. The Queen did not simply dine. She performed. And behind the spectacle of silver goblets and peacock feathers was an invisible army. Dozens of cooks, scullions, bakers, roasters, butchers, brewers, and servers, all coordinated to create something more than food, an act of majesty. Tonight's feast is not just another dinner. It is a political moment. A foreign ambassador is present, watching, recording, judging. A noble family from the north is also in attendance, potential allies or future rebels. Every bite, every goblet, every dish is a message, a performance of power, wealth, and control. You, the master cook of the royal kitchens, understand this better than most. You've worked for decades to reach this position. You've served under 3 monarchs. You remember the chaos of Mary's reign. You remember the panic of Edward's illnesses. And now, under Elizabeth, you are expected to deliver perfection. Always. In the weeks leading up to the event, you oversaw the gathering of supplies. 12 barrels of the finest Gascony wine. 8 deer from the Royal Park. Spices from the Levant. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. Sugar loaves, shaved and ground by hand. Fish preserved in salt. Eels fresh in the Thames, and game birds sent from noble estates. You've ordered the construction of elaborate sugar sculptures, called subtleties, that depict the Queen's coat of arms surrounded by allegorical figures. Justice, peace, and victory. These are not simply decorative. They are edible propaganda. The menu will span dozens of courses, each served in waves, each one symbolic, each one intended to impress. There will be gilded marchpane, molded into Tudor roses. Dishes spiced so richly that their aroma alone announces royal dominance. Meat pies with the crust carved into miniature battlements. Roasted swan, its feathers reattached after cooking. And then, the final triumph, a sugar castle taller than a man, with colored banners and tiny figurines within. A marvel that took 5 men 2 weeks to build. But you know the risks. The kitchen fire might go out. The swan might burn. The sugar sculpture could collapse. A single wrong dish sent to the wrong table could offend the Duke, or worse, insult the Queen. That night, the kitchen is silent with tension. You pace constantly. You taste nothing. You trust your men, but you check everything. Steam curls around your ankles. The firelight makes your face shine like iron. When the bell rings and the first course leaves the kitchen, you don't breathe. Upstairs, the feast unfolds like a play. Course after course. Bite after bite. The Queen smiles, only faintly, as she lifts a small silver fork. Still a curiosity at the time. You hear later that the ambassador leaned toward a scribe and whispered, "This is a country ruled by appetite and precision." He meant it as a compliment. The feast was a success, and you, unknown to history, were its architect. Now let's step away from the grand feasting halls and look behind the curtain, into the quiet, hidden world of the royal kitchen itself and the man who ran it. Thomas Wolverton. Not a household name, not a general, not a courtier whispered about in scandalous poems, but a man who held the keys to the royal pantry. Literally, he served under multiple Tudor monarchs, and though little survives of his personal writings, the records of court tell a rich story, if we read between the lines. Thomas was not simply a man who stirred pots. He was a strategist, a bureaucrat, and a quiet diplomat. Every morning began with tallies. What meat had arrived? How many barrels of flour had been stored correctly? Were the eel baskets fresh? Did the kitchen boys sweep out the hearths? He carried a heavy ring of iron keys. One for the spice cupboard, one for the wine cellar, one for the meat larder, and one, always polished, for the sugar vault. Sugar was gold, imported at immense cost, guarded like a treasure. It was stored behind thick doors, sometimes with wax seals to detect tampering. And Thomas held the only key. In winter, his job changed. Roads were impassable, deliveries delayed. Preservation became an art. Salting, drying, smoking, fermenting. A mistake meant royal guests would be served spoiled meat. A humiliation punishable by exile or imprisonment. He also knew the taste of the court. Queen Elizabeth, famously finicky, preferred small portions and foreign spices. Her courtiers wanted heavy meats, rich sauces, and sweet wines. He kept detailed lists. Who was allergic to what? Who disliked onions? Who secretly fed food to their dogs under the table? He observed everything. He trained new cooks carefully. They had to memorize not only recipes, but etiquette. Never walk in front of a noble, never speak unless spoken to, never taste with your fingers, never wipe your hands on your apron in front of a lady. And then there was the politics. A misplaced dish could be interpreted as an insult. If the ambassador from Spain was served second, not first, it might trigger weeks of diplomatic tension. Once, a plate meant for the Duke of Norfolk was mistakenly sent to a visiting French lord. The Duke, known for his temper, stormed out. Thomas spent the night crafting a formal apology menu, a rare diplomatic document delivered not with ink, but with lamb and almond sauce and a poetic garnish of candied rose petals. There were dangers, too. Food tasters were required for every royal meal. Poison was a constant fear. The kitchen employed apothecaries and herbalists to identify suspicious herbs. At least once, Thomas had to testify in court about a cook who'd been caught slipping powders into a stew pot. The motive? Not politics, jealousy. But Thomas survived. He kept his head, his position, and his honor. For decades, he served with quiet dignity. No scandals, no glory, just food, every day, without error. When he finally retired, the court records note one simple phrase: Master Wolverton, dismissed with grace and gratitude for 34 years of faithful service to Her Majesty's table. And then silence. He disappears from the record, like most cooks of history. But every grand feast, every smiling noble, every diplomatic treaty toasted with wine, they all owed something to his hand. Now imagine a cool spring evening in the year 1579. You're standing in the long shadow of Kenilworth Castle, a place of stone banners and echoes. Inside, something unusual is happening. The castle kitchens are alive with energy, because tonight a foreign duke will dine with the English queen. That foreign duke is Francois, Duke of Anjou, a suitor. Yes, a potential husband for Queen Elizabeth I. And the cook in charge of this evening's meal is faced with a nearly impossible task. Please a queen known for her precision, flatter a French noble who considers English food barbaric, and satisfy a room full of court watchers who care more about political symbols than actual taste. What dish do you serve when Europe is watching? The answer, roasted peacock. But not just any roasted peacock. This one has been prepared according to an ancient and theatrical method. The bird is skinned, then roasted, then dressed again in its original feathers, which are stiffened, oiled, and set in place to make the bird appear as though it never left its perch. A golden crown is placed upon its head. A sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, is tucked beneath one wing. Its beak is tipped with gold leaf. This is not a meal. It is a message. The peacock, in many traditions, is a symbol of immortality and divine right. Its shimmering feathers, like eyes, speak to vigilance. Its regal bearing speaks to majesty. To present it at the center of the table is to say, "Behold England, beautiful, unyielding, watchful." The Duke of Anjou is impressed, or so he seems. He leans forward, takes a bite. He nods, murmurs something in French. His entourage claps politely. But then, a misstep. The Duke's steward, perhaps trying to be clever, remarks in English. Ah! The bird returns to life. A miracle, though I fear the English prefer show over substance. The room stiffens. Across the table, Lord Burleigh, the Queen's trusted adviser, narrows his eyes. It is not the words alone that cause tension, but the implication that English cooks are imitators, that English royalty hides behind spectacle. Queen Elizabeth, without flinching, lifts her goblet and speaks softly. Then let the French learn what it is to dine among lions. And the next course arrives. This time, a boar's head, its eyes made of onyx, its tongue laced with gold-dusted herbs, its tusks carved from ivory. The kitchen had prepared both courses in case the Queen wanted to send a message. She did. By the time the meal ends, no one remembers what the Duke said. They remember only the Queen's response and the feast that carried it. The cooks, meanwhile, breathe only when the last dish has been cleared. A single remark from a steward, one misplaced joke, and the kitchen nearly became the backdrop for an international embarrassment. In the days that follow, the diplomatic mission continues, but the mood is changed. The Duke leaves without a proposal. England remains unmarried, but the Queen and her cooks have made their point. Food, in the Tudor world, was not just sustenance. It was theater. It was politics. It was power, plated and served with ceremony. And sometimes it was the difference between peace and insult. Imagine yourself now not in a castle or feast hall, but in the quiet ruins of a manor long forgotten. The walls are low, crumbled by time. The roof is gone. Trees have grown up through the floors, and birds nest where banners once hung. But beneath the dirt, under layers of dust and decay, lie the faintest traces of a once busy kitchen. Here, archaeologists crouch carefully, brushing gently through centuries of ash. They are looking for scraps, clues, evidence of daily life that is no longer written down. They find it not in scrolls or letters, but in the shape of a soot line, in the discoloration of a hearthstone, in a smear of fat blackened into a clay pot. These are the remains of meals no one remembered to remember. Charred lentils fused to the bottom of a cooking bowl. A few pear seeds scorched from a fire too hot. Fish bones thrown carelessly into the ash pile. The core of a tiny apple dried to a dark, leathery twist. These tell the quiet story of what was cooked and sometimes burned. In one site, a small manor house believed to have been abandoned after plague. Researchers discover something curious. A patch of hearth ash, clearly swept and flattened, but strangely glittering. When examined under a microscope, the glitter reveals itself. Fine fragments of glass and tiny grains of blackened sugar. A sweet syrup had spilled into the fire at some point. It hissed, crackled, hardened, shattered. But why? What dish was being prepared? And by whom? Theories emerge. One archaeologist suggests it might have been a rudimentary pear tart, made with preserved fruit soaked in honey or early cane sugar. Perhaps a scullery maid spilled it while turning too quickly, or a young apprentice misjudged the flames. Another theory is more ceremonial. Perhaps the kitchen was preparing a rare sweetmeat for a feast. Sugar being expensive and difficult to come by. The spill, then, would have been a small disaster. Still others suggest the possibility of play. A kitchen boy sneaking sugar crystals to chew. A mistake quickly hidden before master returned. These answers we will never know. But the sugar's presence speaks volumes. Because in a world where sweetness was precious, where sugar came by ship, guarded and costly, to find in a ruined hearth means it was used, valued, lost. And so, from a sprinkle of scorched sweetness, an entire moment rises from the ash. In another dig, this time in a rural cottage, Archaeologists find a row of worn stones just beside what would have been the cooking hearth. Each stone is smooth, charred at one end, and slightly curved, likely used to rest cooking pots or as makeshift griddles. But one stone has faint carvings, scratched-in shapes, circles, loop stars. They seem playful, almost childish. But there's intention. Did a boar cook scratch these in with a spoon handle? Did someone wait for a stew to thicken, idly tracing dreams into stone? We'll never know. But even in these most practical of spaces, a hearth, a stone, a place for heat and hunger, there was room for imagination, a flicker of artistry beside the fire. The kitchens of the past, seen through these traces, become more than places of labor. They were living, breathing spaces where mistakes happened, where people laughed or worried or waited and sometimes dreamed. Not everything is written in ink or kept on vellum. Some histories are left behind in the soot. Let's take a slow walk now through a medieval village, not the manor or the castle, but the quiet lanes in between. Dirt paths softened by time, timber-framed homes leaning slightly with age. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows, faint and distant, but it's not the animals that catch your attention. It's the smell. Warm, earthy, nutty, slightly sour, and unmistakably human. It's bread, not the kind you find sliced and wrapped in plastic. This is older, heartier, uneven in shape and weight. The crust is thick, sometimes blistered. The crumb inside is dark or gray, speckled with seeds or grains. Some loaves are dense enough to last a week. Others are gone by sunset. Bread was the foundation of medieval life, eaten by nearly everyone at nearly every meal. But it wasn't one uniform food. In fact, the variety of breads was astonishing and largely forgotten. Archaeologists have begun studying bread residues. Crumbs fused at pots, flattened impressions in clay ovens, fossilized remains in rubbish pits. From these tiny traces, they recreate forgotten flavors. Some breads were made from rye or barley, especially in the north and among the poor. These were tough, chewy loaves, often baked on hearthstones. Others, closer to the Mediterranean, used spelt, millet, or emmer, grains that are rare today, but once shaped entire cultures. Still others mixed what was available: wheat, lentils, mashed chestnuts, even ground peas. These composite breads were creative and practical, stretching a small store of grain into many meals. In the ruins of a monastery bakery, one sample revealed traces of herbs pressed into the top crust, thyme, lovage, and possibly sage. A holy man's comfort, or a way to flavor otherwise bland fare. In a London tenement site, researchers found a slice of burned bread, layered in clay and trash, but still bearing fingerprint impressions. A child, maybe, who pressed their hand too firmly onto the loaf. Or a baker leaving a mark. We can only guess. Bread ovens, too, offer clues. In one village, a communal oven once stood at the edge of the square. It was large, shared by several families, and burned wood for fuel. People would line up in the morning with dough ready on cloth boards. They'd chat, exchange news, gossip, and wait for the hot stones to be ready. And yet, in one excavation of such an oven site, they discovered not just the usual signs of baking, but something else. Tiny seeds of fennel, caraway, and even coriander. It suggests someone, perhaps many someones, were flavoring their bread far beyond what history books suggest. Flavored breads? In the 1300s? Yes, quietly, creatively, without recipe books or fanfare. People experimented, not for wealth or performance, but for joy, taste, warmth. These weren't showpieces for royal feasts. They were made to be eaten by tired hands after long days. Bread shared between siblings. Bread torn and dipped into broth. Bread packed into cloth and taken to fields. There was also the curious case of trenchers, Thick slabs of stale bread used as plates at feasts. These weren't eaten by the lords and ladies, but by the servants afterward. They soaked up sauces, meat juices, and rich drippings. Archaeological analysis of these trencher remains has shown surprising things. Not just gravy or grease, but fragments of raisins, spices, even almond paste. The leftover bread of the wealthy held within it the flavors of banquets. For the poor who ate them, these trenchers were their only taste of a world far removed. And so, from monk to peasant, cook to child, bread was never just bread. It was warmth, work, community, memory. And though we've forgotten many of the recipes, the flavors, the shapes, the ovens remember. Imagine now you're seated at a long wooden table. It's not a king's hall or a bustling tavern, but a quiet monastic dining room. The room is cool, shadowed, lit by narrow windows and a single iron lamp. The stone walls are plain, but there's a gentle scent in the air, faintly sweet, slightly sharp. It's cinnamon. Yes, cinnamon in a monastery. How? You might ask, where did it come from? This is a forgotten mystery of medieval food. The spice trail. The enormous journeys of flavor. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, ginger. These were the treasures of the medieval pantry. Not because they massed spoiled food, a myth often repeated, but because they were expensive, coveted, and deeply symbolic. Cloves came from the Moluccas, nutmeg from Banda, saffron from the Mediterranean, ginger traveled from India, all moved through complex networks of Arab, Venetian, and Genoese merchants. And when they arrived, if they arrived, they were measured by the pinch. In wealthy kitchens, these spices weren't just flavoring agents. They were cultural symbols. A dish with saffron didn't just taste golden, it looked golden. It communicated status, wealth, and connection. But spices weren't only for the rich. In some monasteries, ginger was steeped in hot water to make a calming broth. Saffron, mixed with eggs, colored special feast day breads. In small villages, dried herbs and local roots, wild garlic, tansy, horseradish, served a similar purpose, giving depth to otherwise simple meals. The meanings extended beyond taste. In medieval religious texts, certain foods took on sacred symbolism. Almonds, for instance, represented purity. Fish, eaten on fasting days, echoed spiritual discipline. Even humble lentils, which were slow to cook, came to symbolize patience. There were dishes with names like white pot, tansy pudding, Lenten hash, and golden leech. Many of these no longer exist today, but in fragments of manuscripts, handwritten cookbooks, household ledgers, scribbled inventories, we find their echoes. One such cookbook, compiled in the 14th century, lists recipes like pottage of onions and eggs served with mustard seed, a dish of boiled pears mashed and blended with honey and wine, chickpeas stewed in almond milk, thickened with breadcrumbs. These recipes read like riddles. Quantities are vague. Timing is never listed. Much was known by practice, passed down not on parchment but through hands, mothers, stewards, cooks. And beneath the recipes was often a layer of belief. In one text, a note instructs, stir not counterclockwise on feast days. Another warns against preparing eel on midsummer, lest misfortune arrive. Superstition blended with sustenance. Even food presentation had meaning. In royal courts, elaborate dishes were served shaped like animals, towers, or mythic creatures, not for nourishment, but spectacle. A swan stuffed with herbs and stitched back into its feathers. A jelly molded into a miniature castle. These were edible performances. But in smaller homes, food carried quieter symbolism. A loaf marked with a cross before baking. A pie sealed with a thumbprint for luck. A stew stirred with a wooden spoon carved by an ancestor. Food was never just food. It was memory, magic, message. And in the archaeological layers beneath kitchens and hearths, we sometimes find tiny ceramic molds, shaped like birds, flowers, or stars. Were they used for pastry? For holy day butter? No one can say for sure. But they speak of a world where even the simplest snack might carry meaning. Today, when we eat, we often think only of flavor or nutrition. But centuries ago, taste was just one part of the experience. There was ritual, symbol, story. Every meal whispered something. And many of those whispers are still waiting to be heard. Let's return now to a place we've only glimpsed from the edges. A castle kitchen. It's not a single room, but a collection of spaces. Warm, smoky, constantly alive with activity. A place of noise, motion, and most of all, heat. Imagine yourself stepping across a worn threshold into the heart of a noble household's culinary world. The floor is rough stone, uneven in places. The walls are soot-streaked. The scent of roasted meat, boiling vegetables, and damp herbs clings to the air. You feel a slight moisture, condensation from boiling pots, and the cool breath of nearby cellar doors. In front of you stands an enormous fireplace, wider than a carriage, with hooks and bars for suspending iron cauldrons and meat spits. Flames lick the underside of hanging pots. A boy turns a roasting jack slowly, his arm already tired. There are no printed recipes, no timers, no labels on the ingredients. Everything is remembered, estimated, judged by smell, texture, and repetition. In a noble household, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of mouths must be fed daily. And that means a castle kitchen is an engine, constantly moving, constantly adapting. There are layers within this space. At the lowest level, young assistants, often children of servants or distant kin, peel vegetables, grind spices, and scrub pots. Their hands are red and raw in the cold months. Their work is rarely noticed. Above them, the assistant cooks. These men and women actually prepare the dishes, chopping, boiling, stewing. They manage the heat of the fire and the pace of the meal. And above them all, the master cook. He doesn't touch food as often as one might think. Instead, he oversees, plans, coordinates with a steward who supplies ingredients, ensures dishes arrive in the correct order on time and in the right form. His job is part art, part politics. And within all this structure, rules exist. Meat is served in specific ways on specific days. Fish on Fridays and holy days. Baked goods must match the status of the table. A noble's trencher should never be burned. The pie for a visiting baron must be gilded with egg yolk. But still, behind closed kitchen doors, there are secrets. Cooks sneak bites of the Lord's roast. A ladleful of soup to check the salt. A sweet custard set aside, accidentally, for someone's cousin. The master cooks sometimes give these unspoken indulgences a blind eye. After all, long hours breed quiet rebellion. In some records, there are punishments for these offenses. One steward's ledger from 1476 lists 3 eggs stolen, clotted cream found missing, and honey cakes improperly counted. The offenders were fined a half-day's wages. A mild rebuke, but one that shows how closely food was watched. But it wasn't just about theft. There were class boundaries, too. A serving boy might carry food to the high table, but never taste it. A kitchen maid might cook a stuffed goose with quince, yet never be allowed to eat it. The difference between preparing and consuming was sharply drawn. And yet, some dishes found their way across that line. Leftovers, mistakes, extras, the end of a roasted marrow bone, sucked clean by candlelight, a scrap of pastry crust shared in the scullery, a lick of spice custard from a forgotten spoon. Even in formality, there was humanity. The castle kitchen was, in many ways, a microcosm of medieval society, hierarchical, ritualized, and yet deeply human. Heat brought people together. Hunger evened them out. A good stew could soften harsh words. And so, when you imagine a great feast, with trumpets, banners, lords in fur-lined cloaks and ladies in velvet sleeves, remember, it began here, in a smoky room, with blistered hands, with stolen tastes, with warmth and work, and the slow rhythm of something ancient. The castle cook knew all of this. Every layer, every flavor, every silence. And yet he rarely sat at the table. He didn't need to. The kitchen was his kingdom. Imagine yourself now seated at the far end of a long wooden table. Not just any table. This one sits beneath heavy beams in the great hall of a castle. A fire crackles nearby. Candles drip slowly onto iron sconces. You're here as an observer, unnoticed, a silent guest at a noble feast. The smells are rich and unfamiliar, not unpleasant, but certainly unexpected. You pick out the sweetness of spiced wine, the earthy tang of roast game, and something more delicate, perhaps rose water and almond. The nobility did not eat like the peasantry, where field labor might subsist on bread, onions, and pottage. A noble's table was a theater of abundance. Each course, and there were many, served not only nourishment but prestige. Food, in this world, was a display of wealth, education, and power. Let's look closely. A typical noble feast in the later medieval period could contain 3 or more courses, each with several dishes. The sequence was deliberate. Lighter dishes to begin, perhaps soft cheeses, preserved fruits, or seasoned soups, followed by heavy meats and elaborate pastries. Finally, the sweet course, not dessert as we know it today, but a mix of candied fruits, spiced nuts, and fragrant wafers. The meal might begin with a subtlety, a showpiece of molded marzipan or sculptured dough and sugar, made to resemble a castle, a unicorn, or a Bible scene. It was rarely eaten, but admired. Conversation often paused when the subtlety was revealed. Imagine the rustle of velvet sleeves as guests leaned forward, the slight smile of a noble woman seeing a rose-shaped custard placed before her, the raised brow of a visiting knight at the sight of gilded roasted peacock, its feathers replaced after cooking, shimmering blue and green. Not everything was as it appeared. Meat pies could be filled with exotic spices, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, not because they tasted better, but because the use of such imported goods announced status. Sugar, in particular, was expensive and used liberally at elite tables. Fish could be reshaped to look like birds. Birds stuffed with other birds. A chicken inside a duck inside a goose were not uncommon. This was food as illusion, as luxury, as performance. And yet it was more than show. Nobles believed that food influenced health and humors. Meals were often planned with the guidance of medical texts. Cold meats might be paired with warming spices. Wines were infused with herbs. Certain fruits were only served in specific seasons, for fear they would upset the stomach. Utensils were sparse. Guests brought their own knives. Spoons were shared. Forks, though known, were not common in England until centuries later. Hands were used delicately. Bread trenchers acted as plates, soaking up juices, and sometimes being passed to the poor after meal. Music often played. Minstrels moved between tables. A falconer might walk through with his bird, or an acrobat might perform a quiet trick between courses. Meanwhile, in the background, servants darted silently. Some held towels and ewers for hand washing between courses. Others refilled goblets or brought silver dishes on trays of polished wood. The hall was warm, but never loud. Conversation was measured, laughter muted. This was a place of decorum, but under that decorum, strange moments still slipped through. There are stories, recorded in letters and chronicles, of spilled sauces, sneezed on trenchers, and even a dog stealing a leg of venison from under the high table. One lord, frustrated by a lukewarm dish, flung it out the window. Another knight fell asleep into a bowl of pottage after too much mulled wine. Even elegance had its boundaries. And yet, to the outsider, especially a visiting peasant or lower merchant, a noble feast would have seemed impossible. The sheer amount of food, the silence of the servants, the knowledge of which dish came next. It was a world both theatrical and restrictive. Meals in noble households were rarely about hunger. They were about identity. To be served was to be remembered. To eat without knowing how was to be marked as uncultured. To comment on the wrong dish, a social risk. So, imagine again our quiet guest at the table, you unseen. The candlelight dances across silver plates. A roast boar glistens with honey. Someone nearby discusses the properties of saffron for digestion. And outside, beyond the stone walls, a kitchen maid tastes a crust of pie, quickly, before anyone notices. 2 meals, 2 worlds, 1 table. As we reach the final chamber of our historical wandering, let us pause not at the feast, but in the shadows behind it. Imagine yourself now standing at the threshold of the lowest, darkest corner of the castle's service wing, a place rarely mapped, rarely described, and almost never remembered. Here live the forgotten ones, the scullions, the spit boys, the coal fetchers and floor scrubbers. To the noble at table, they were background noise. To the steward, they were necessary. To history, they are largely invisible. But here, in the silence of night, we'll try to see them. The scullery was a cramped stone chamber, perpetually damp and dim, smelling of soaked wood, smoke, and discarded bones. It had no fire of its own. Water was brought in heavy buckets from the well or the kitchen cistern. Everything, every pot, every knife, every wooden platter, passed to the hands of the scullions. Some were children, others elderly or disabled. In many households, it was a punishment post for servants who had offended or who lacked skill for higher positions. Yet without them, the kitchen ground to a halt. They worked before the feast began and long after it ended. A day might begin with firewood collection, hauling bundles of kindling up icy steps, then scrubbing soot-blackened pots with handfuls of sand. Later, scrubbing floors with straw bundles and vinegar. Later still, standing on cold stone floors, washing grease-caked pans under trickling water. There was no applause, no gold. A scullion's hands were always red, raw, or burned. A spit boy might suffer blisters from turning the crank for hours. Many servants lost their sense of smell. The constant reek of fire and fat overwhelmed the senses. Some households had kitchen rules, posted in Latin or French, reminders of silence, punctuality, and cleanliness. One castle's record from the 14th century reads, "Those who drop a trencher in dirt must wash it at once, lest flies gather. Those who eat the Lord's cheese without leave will have their wages docked." Even laughter could be forbidden. Too much noise, the steward believed, disrupted the harmony of the cook's rhythm. And so, these servants became part of the kitchen itself, silent, steady, enduring. But even here, in hardship, there were small flashes of life. A girl might sing softly while scraping pans. A boy might carve a face into a discarded potato. A scullion might sneak a whisper to the castle baker, hoping for a bit of sweet dough left from the morning's bread. Sometimes, a cook showed mercy. A scrap of rabbit meat passed quietly. A nod of approval. A warm spot near the hearth. Share at the end of the night. There were rivalries, too. The stew assistant thought himself better than the scullery girl. The pastry boy mocked the one who cleaned the drains. And above them all, the master cook rarely spoke to any of them by name. But they worked together, side by side, hour after hour, learning the rhythms of boiling and blanching, stewing and serving. They rarely wrote. They rarely read. But they remembered recipes, schedules, who arrived first, who left early, and sometimes they left their mark, carvings in the walls, a small drawing scratched into the underside of a pantry shelf, a name etched faintly beside the door, and 1479. We cannot hear her voice, but we can imagine it, and perhaps that's enough. So as our story draws near its end, and the banquet candles gutter low, remember them, the unseen, the unpraised, the quiet tide behind the noble tide. Their feet tread the same halls. Their hands fed the same mouths. Their stories deserve to be told, even in a whisper, even as you fall asleep. And now, dear listener, as the last embers fade from the great hearth, and the kitchens fall silent once more, we gently close the book on this quiet journey through the castle's forgotten corners. You've wandered through the narrow stone corridors of a medieval kitchen. You stood beside the roasting spit, breathed in the scent of rosemary and ash, and watched both lord and laborers partake in the most universal ritual of all, the preparation and sharing of food. What began as a day in the life of a cook became something more, a portrait not only of the meals they made, but of the lives behind the ladles and knives. In this softly unfolding chapter of boring history, we saw the contrast between the high table and the hearth. We traced the delicate etiquette of noble dining and the rough, callous hands that made such luxury possible. We listened not just for clatter of pewter plates or the rustle of linen aprons, but for the rhythm of lives that often went unrecorded, cooks, maids, boys, and girls, whose labor kept castles running, unseen and unsung. It's strange, perhaps, to find peace in such a place. A kitchen filled with heat and haste might seem the last spot to seek rest. And yet, there's comfort in knowing that even in the most chaotic spaces of history, life unfolded in daily patterns. People woke, worked, cooked, laughed, and slept. They hoped for warmth, for full bellies, for soft bread and easier mornings. And now, as your own night deepens, perhaps there's a rhythm here too, the gentle cadence of storytelling, the soft-spoken history documentary whispered by the sleepy historian. This has been another chapter in the library of boring history for sleep, a place of calm bedtime storytelling and ambient sounds, where archaeology, Roman history, and castle kitchens are not just topics, but companions in your winding path toward rest. So let the candles burn low. Let the feast end. May the air grow cool and the silence grow deep. And may you drift softly now into forgotten pages of time. Good night from the kitchens. Good night from the past. And good night from the sleepy historian.